All right, so today's design topic will be responsive design, following up on our programming lecture on media queries and responsive programming. So just to start off, get you guys awake, can anyone guess how many people have access to the internet in 2023? Feel free to just shout it out. 3 billion? That's a good guess. It's actually 5 billion, which is kind of crazy. If you think about it, the Earth has like 8 plus billion people, I think, something like that. That means like over half the Earth has access to internet today, which means internet is accessible from all kinds of devices, whether it's a laptop, tablet, smartphone, all that kind of stuff. We're kind of past the PC era. We're more into like the mobile devices now in the 2000s. This chart kind of shows how media consumption has changed over the years. So you can kind of see in 2011, there was a lot more emphasis on TV, like radio, and now 2020, this was like ended in 2021, but mobile has definitely increased a lot more. And that's probably because of like Apple, Samsung, all that taking over the world, but yeah. So I don't know if you ever experienced this, but you've probably opened a website on your desktop and then tried to open it on your phone, and you're like, oh, this doesn't quite look the same. So like, why won't your site work on all devices? If you compare like the original desktop with the three cats, and you take it and try to open that website on an iPhone, obviously you're not going to be able to see the three cats. And why is this? It's because the size of the mobile device can only support for the size of a one cat versus all three. There's actually a really fun mobile-friendly test like that Google has, where you can check to see if a website is mobile-friendly. Moving forward, different devices come with different screen sizes, I'm sure you guys are aware, and different rendering engines. We'll get into that on what a rendering engine is, but essentially, content that is designed for a laptop with a much bigger screen won't naturally look the same on a tablet or mobile with a much smaller screen. It's a very intuitive thing. But now, as a designer, what does this mean for us? Well, we want to make sure that our web designs will work on all devices and browsers, which leads us in today's topic, responsive web design. Now, what is responsive web design? It's essentially designing websites for multiple screen sizes and devices so you have an optimal experience for every user at every single size. Responsive design deals with the three main topics we'll go into today, which is browser compatibility, screen resolutions, and mobile compatibility. We'll tackle the first issue, which is browser compatibility. So in a few slides before, I mentioned a rendering engine. This is essentially software that will draw text and images onto the screen. So you guys have been working with HTML and CSS, and the engine will take that text from your HTML, let's say, and then format it based on your CSS file. So browser compatibility is essentially the ability of a website to function as quote unquote expected on any web browser. Some very popular ones are like Google Chrome, Safari, Mozilla, Microsoft. These are much more older ones, but I'm sure you guys probably just use like Chrome and Safari. But each browser will actually interpret your code slightly differently depending on the engine. And even though you have the same HTML or CSS file, it'll take that code and kind of process it slightly different. So here's an example of where you might tell your HTML code to have a dotted border, but it's gonna look a little bit different depending on what browser you're using. So on Chrome over here, you can see on the top right corner, it's gonna have the dotted, but having the corners a little bit more defined, whereas in like Internet Explorer, if anyone still uses that, it's a little bit more uniform, a little more dotted. So it really shows that you can have the same code in your HTML and CSS, yet it'll show up slightly different on your screen, which is very interesting. Something that you can do to kind of make it a little more cohesive is using vendor prefixes. So this keeps your CSS selectors a little more consistent. Browsers have been trying to add more support with CSS features, but sometimes there are new CSS features that like just come up because things are always evolving, and a lot of times you're gonna have to use a vendor prefix so that all types of browsers can support it. So they're usually used for like simple things such as a linear gradient, perhaps as like backgrounds, transitions, etc. And I do know that a lot of major browsers are nowadays trying to go into ad supports or feature queries, but that's not quite in the scope of this class. And I personally still use like WebKit, Moz, and O transition for a lot of my smaller projects. So definitely both are being used nowadays. This is a great resource. It's called caniuse.com, and you can literally search up the CSS selector and see if it's supported by different types of browsers. So, hand? Yes.
Yeah, how do you know if you use
So usually it's just like opening the website up on different, I guess, browsers. Like that's how I personally test it. Usually switching between Safari and Google Chrome. I think the border ones is pretty common. Like anytime you use some type of border, that'll be slightly different. I can't think of any others at the top of my head, but I think transitions might be slightly different. Opacity, borders is a pretty big one, but yeah. I would say for the most part, nowadays, a lot of rendering engines try to keep it more consistent amongst a lot of CSS things. So I can't give you like exact ones, but I think it's just mostly testing it on your own. Any more questions? That was a good question. If not, I'm going to move on to the second topic, which is screen resolutions. So resolution is just referring to how many pixels your screen can display horizontally and then vertically. So depending on, let's say you have a MacBook, between a 13-inch and a 15-inch MacBook, it's gonna display your website slightly different just because they're not the same amount of pixels. So changing the size of your browser window, if you've ever minimized your screen, can also affect how your website looks. Here are some of the more common screen resolutions: 1366 by 768, 1920 by 1080, and so forth. Don't want to bore you guys, but these are pretty common in the industry and just in devices overall. Now moving forward to what we want to set our ideal kind of size to is we like to think of things in containers and try to make your content fit in that kind of container. So that way, when you're working on perhaps larger screen sizes, you can still have everything fit in the container. That makes sense. So let's say you have a container size of 1024 by 768. This is kind of the ideal standard industry container size. Anything larger than this, which essentially is think of your MacBook, any PC like desktop, this will fit a 1024 by 768 pixel container because anything larger than that will show a good viewing experience. Here is an example. If you guys have ever used Tumblr, this is back in their old UI days. I do miss these days. But essentially, it kind of looks like Instagram's almost, of where like you're scrolling vertically, but they utilize a lot of negative space on their desktop view on the left-hand side, where you can see everything still fits in that green kind of rectangle, and your main viewpoint is still on there, but you have a lot of negative space so that when you shrink the viewport of your device, or maybe you just switch devices, maybe an iPad or a mobile device, it's still going to look the exact same, but you just kind of remove that negative space. And notice how you don't really have to do anything in terms of just like changing your design, you're just minimizing the negative space. So when you're working with lower screen resolutions, David covered this today, but you're gonna end up using CSS media queries to kind of adjust for that. And while in this example, we went from like a desktop to perhaps like maybe a tablet view, because I think this is still kind of big, let's now move on to mobile compatibility, which is our last issue for responsive website. Any questions so far? Not, then we're going to get into designing for mobile devices. So user interfaces for a mobile device are quite different than for desktop. If you guys have ever seen a mobile app or just compared the two between your desktop and your phone, they're going to differ in three main ways. It's screen size, so I think that's the most obvious. Touch screen possibilities, which you guys might not have thought of until maybe right now, and then performance. Between mobile and desktop, mobile is obviously smaller in screen size. They'll use touchscreen, and the performance is relatively slow. It's actually like half times slower compared to desktop. So that's just something to keep a track of. And for desktops, you have a mouse/trackpad usually. So something on desktop that doesn't really work well for mobile, for example, is hover. If you guys worked with like hover animations, like trying to make like a button change color when you hover over it, that's not gonna really work the same because you can't necessarily hover for a mobile device. You're just basically touching the button. So that would just be like clicking something. So first into screen size, obviously screen size is much, much smaller on a mobile device versus a desktop. So how can we combat this issue? We want to focus on the content and try to tuck away all the negative space. Since we have a lot more restricted space, most mobile UIs should try to stack elements vertically. This helps maximize the width and emphasis on each element. And I'm going to give you a few examples. Here's the Daily Cow website. And notice how in this main like picture area for the news of like whatever like news is trying to be highlighted for that day, there's kind of like a scrolling carousel. So in this case, they're still highlighting, let's say, I think there's like 5 articles because you can see the little dots. They're still showing all 5, but it's more of a, you scroll and then you see more content. And they kind of hide that horizontally because there just is not enough space horizontally because it's a mobile device. So in this case, you would try to restrict your use of position fixed elements since they're going to reduce your space for content. You can still use it. It's not like you can't. For example, the top bar and add at the bottom are fixed. Generally, these are probably the areas where you want to keep things fixed. You would have like a nav bar, maybe a hamburger, like the 3 kind of lines stacked on top of each other, so you can access other links on the website easily. But for most of the things, you kind of just want to maximize your space. And here's a great example of it. This is DoorDash's app. If you guys use DoorDash, I use it too much, honestly. But every single one of their rows has their elements kind of like in a little like circle or a little container. And in order to see more, you just scroll like to the right on your phone. And you can still see the content. Like for example, here you have like the free 10 pieces of nuggets on McDonald's. If you want to see the next thing, I think this is like Caesars or something like that. Like it shows just like a little preview, but it tells the user like, oh, there is something more there. Like I should scroll to see what it is. I think also a lot of times mobile apps will have an automatic kind of scrolling time. So after like 10 minutes, not 10 minutes, 10 seconds, you'll probably have it automatically just move to the next element. So that way the user can see, oh, there's something new on the app. But yeah, this is DoorDash has a very clean UI to show like how you would kind of use mobile design where you have a lot of elements. There's still a lot of content on this page. Yeah, it's a very small screen size and you're able to get a lot of things from offers, convenience, groceries, and then you want to see kinds of cuisines, you can see what safe stores you have, etc. But yeah, moving on more into the mobile devices. I don't know how you guys hold your phones, but I try to hold mine like as most people do, 49%. You hold it with like your right or left hand or whatnot, and you kind of just scroll using your thumb. So there's a lot of studies that people do on like reachability, which this slide shows. Obviously, where you hold your phone is going to depend, but let's say you're holding it the most common way, which is just with one hand, and your thumb is doing most of the scrolling / reaching on your phone. You're going to have a much easier time reaching the bottom elements on your phone versus the top elements. And it's just a very like natural thing. This is why when you're like texting, the keyboard's like on the bottom of the screen and not like at the top. Like, why would you want that? That's terrible design. So reachability is a really important thing to think about when you're designing your mobile app. If there's anything super important that you want to highlight, you want to make sure that your user is able to reach that element. So on a mobile touchscreen, like thumbs are also less precise than cursors. I'm sure you guys have texted your fair share of grammar mistakes when texting your friends because thumbs are not the most accurate. So a lot of times you want to add padding to buttons, just any element that you have so that you can accommodate for the size of people's thumbs. So like I previously said, commonly used buttons should be placed at the bottom of the screen. This just improves reachability. And here's another thing, when you're having buttons, like you want to make sure that they're a large enough size so like you can click on them, because there's actually been times where I've tried to click on a link on a mobile device and I just like end up clicking completely wrong thing just because it's so small. So just make sure that your elements on the mobile device will have accessible dimensions. Lyft has a really, really nice UI as well for mobile reach, just because I'm pretty sure most people only use Lyft on their phone anyways. Uber also as well, but I don't know if you guys have noticed, but whenever you want to order something, the thing kind of pushes up from the bottom, like, oh, where are you going? And then they'll have the prices at the bottom, and then the select lift button also at the bottom. Why? Because that's the most easily reachable area. And it also helps that your map is at the top, but that's not something you necessarily need to click on. You just need to see, oh, where you're going, that's the right destination, cool. Whereas like the elements that you actually want to interact with, which is the submit lift, or like you want to find a lift XL or something like that, that are at the bottom because those are much easier to reach. Here's another example of a desktop to mobile kind of compatibility, or like seeing the UI change from desktop to mobile. This is GitHub's website. It has really good responsiveness, and the design doesn't really change. It just kind of shifts the elements to kind of fit everything. Even though it looks a little different, it's still essentially kind of the same design. On the left-hand side, it's for mobile devices. It's much more squished. I would personally say they need more padding on left and right, but that's just my take. But overall, the content is there. There's a fixed nav bar, and it presents the content in a very digestible way. Then moving on to perhaps maybe a tablet, maybe a smaller desktop size, you have this kind of sign up for GitHub section, and on a larger desktop side, you just move that to the right. Notice how everything, all the elements are still there, but they're just kind of shifted based on the size of the device that you have. Here's another example. This is the Slack website. This whole section I like a lot. It's just very clean. And for the mobile portion, essentially it's like the same thing, same design. They still keep the little puzzle elements, but they just shift it so that everything's kind of stacked vertically, like I previously talked about. So essentially a lot of mobile design is just stacking things vertically, like moving whatever you had to from your left to right to just vertical. And something that actually helps a lot with this is Flexbox. When you're using Flexbox, it kind of naturally does this for you. I don't know if you guys have played around with it enough, but you can have a thing where you can say, I want 3 items on a row, and then shrink it based on that. And then if the device is too small, then just like stack it. There's also external libraries that are great for this, but we're not going to go into that because it's not into the scope of this class. All right, and then I feel like iPhones and iOS are really good at having accessible like design. Here's an example of like if you want to turn on reachability. This is the example, and it really helps with just like changing between apps and stuff. Our last topic, I guess, of mobile design is like a lot of times on a mobile device, performance is usually a lot slower. It's roughly like half of desktop, but a few solutions to this is minimizing heavy JavaScript, which we will learn very soon. Minimizing use of transitions, animations, hover effects, all that stuff, because you can't really use that on a mobile device. And mobile UIs should be as simple as click and scroll. So basically, we covered a lot of things of like, okay, well, mobile design like is really important, right? But how do we transfer that between a desktop versus mobile design? Do we do 2 completely different designs? Well, our solution is a mobile first design. It's a lot harder to squash things down to fit more things in a smaller space than opening things up and adding more things to fill a larger space. I'm sure you guys have had your fair share of trying to like squish everything in a luggage versus like when you're unpacking, it's like much easier, right? In the same sense, like you want to design for mobile first. You want to fit all your content in the smallest container possible. And then you take the same content and then design for larger screens because that content won't be missed. You've already fit that into a very small screen, and now you can just add more space for your larger screens. It really forces you to think about what is important, which we kind of covered in the visual hierarchy lecture, and it also takes accessibility to the next level. Some overall review of today's lecture. Designing for variation is very important. Make sure your websites work for all browsers. Add the vendor prefixes as necessary, and make sure your website works on all devices, not just your desktop. So that employs a mobile first design. Are there any questions? If not, then that brings us to the end of today's lecture. I'm gonna stop sharing real quick.